back. It's Sarah, of course, the Tudor Travel Guide here, and welcome to this month's episode of the A to Z of Tudor Places. Now, once again, although this series is called the A to Z of Tudor Places, we are once again north of the border, and so I will temporarily call it the A to Z of Stuart Places. So I'm delighted once more to be making another friendly incursion across the border into Scotland to talk about the focus of this month's A to Z video, which is of course the market town of Jedburgh. For those of you who don't know Jedburgh, it is situated about 20 miles or so within the Scottish lowlands in the county of Roxburghshire. Now, unlike some of my A to Zs, this one might be relatively brief, because the building in question is not some grand palace like, for example, the old Palace of Hatfield, which we have spoken about in the past. Oh, no, no, no. Instead, it's a small tower house, which is said to have been used by Mary during her stay in the town. However small in stature it might be, but the reason I want to include it here is that the goings-on at Jedburgh during Mary's stay in the town marks one of the many dramatic events in the life of the Scots Queen, one in which she came close to death. So how did Mary come to be at Jedburgh in the first place? Well, during her relatively short 6 years living in Scotland as its reigning monarch, Mary travelled extensively throughout her kingdom on progress. And I would just say here that if you are someone who is interested in learning about all, and I mean all the places visited by Mary, then I can highly recommend a doorstop of a document called The Travels of Mary Queen of Scots by Sid Whitehead. It's sold by the Mary Stuart Society and has been compiled by one of its members, and he has diligently researched a truly comprehensive list of locations in Scotland, France and England that follow Mary from cradle to grave. And if you're interested in buying that, which at the time of recording this is 25 sterling pounds, then I'll put a link in the description below this video. Anyway, my friends, back to our story. Well, part of Mary's reason for travelling so extensively was simply to be seen by her people. But another requirement of the monarch at the time was to fulfil a role in administering justice throughout the realm. And this the king or queen would do in the Eyre courts. Now that's spelled E-Y-R-E, which were held provincially throughout Scotland at the time. And in 1566, when Mary was just 22 years old, the Scots Queen came to the town for that very purpose. But while at Jedburgh, she received some devastating news that her principal advisor, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, had been seriously wounded in a skirmish close to one of his border properties, and that's Hermitage Castle. Now, the Earl of Bothwell, having been wounded, had been taken back to the castle, where many believed that he would die in his bed. Now, it's often been reported that Mary dropped everything and rushed to his side, and that this was a sign that they had already developed a close relationship. Remember, in time, Mary would come to marry the Earl in a rather questionable episode when the Scots Queen was abducted by Bothwell at Linlithgow Bridge as she was leaving her palace at Linlithgow. That, however, my friends, is perhaps another story for another time. But in relation to our story at Jedburgh, the reality actually seems to be that Mary didn't drop everything and go to Bothwell's bedside, but that she waited for the court business to be concluded some 6, 7, 8 days later before riding to Hermitage Castle. Now, Hermitage Castle is around 24 miles from Jedburgh, and Mary not only rode there in one single day, but returned to Jedburgh on the very same day as well. That was a gruelling, 56, 57 mile round trip in the same 24 hours. Extraordinary. Nobody really knows why Mary undertook such an exhausting ride. It was possible that there was not enough room to lodge a royal court at Hermitage Castle, and so she felt compelled to return to Jedburgh. It's also possible that with Hermitage Castle being only some 10 miles from the English border, Mary felt unsafe to remain there, as the land was always subject to incursions from the English, making the Scottish Queen very vulnerable to attack. Now, although Mary was still a young woman in her prime at the time, it does seem that from an early age she had quite a delicate constitution, and certainly on this occasion this incredible feat of riding took its toll, and shortly after arriving back at Jedburgh she fell dangerously ill, vomiting some 50 or 60 times before falling into a stupor. Now, if you want more details on the illness of Mary Queen of Scots whilst at Jedburgh, then make sure you check out the associated blog, and I'll put the link above and in the description below. It really is quite a fascinating account into how her illness developed over a period of days and how she eventually survived. Suffice to say, though, at one stage it was believed that Mary had actually died, and that her half-brother, who was with her at the time, James Stuart, even began to help himself to some of her valuables, an act which he would later, I emphasise, deny. Now, fortunately, Mary's physician, who was in attendance at the time, must have noticed the faintest signs of life, and he insisted that her limbs be bound with bandages and that wine poured down her throat. It's then said that the Queen vomited a large amount of blood, and to cut a slightly longer story short, and I do urge you to read the account, eventually she began to regain consciousness and slowly came back to health. But where exactly did all these events happen? Well, legend has it that this traumatic incident unfolded in a tower house at Jedburgh, which today is known as Queen Mary's House. Now, it wouldn't be history, would it, if there wasn't some controversy as to whether the current house, which stands in lovely, well-tended gardens, is in fact the original building in which Mary lay gravely ill. Some historians have argued that the house was built during the reign of her son James VI of Scotland, and therefore the events could not have unfolded in that building that you see today. However, I think what is agreed is that if the building today is not the original one, it certainly stands in the same position as the original tower house. But to complicate matters further, there's another distinct possibility. At the time, the tower house was owned by the Kerr family. Now, the Kerr family also owned nearby Fernley Castle, and there is some suggestion that Mary may well have been cared for there during her short illness. Now, today the tower house has been converted to a museum in honour of the Scots Queen, and so it is possible to gain access to those upper rooms in which, for a fleeting period of time, Mary's life hung in the balance. Now, I was lucky enough to visit Jedburgh during my own recent trip to Scotland, following in the footsteps of Mary Queen of Scots. And I can tell you that the tower house is sited close to the main high street, and it is indeed set amongst very pretty, quite small but pretty gardens, which are very well cared for and in the summer months full of flowers. If you're travelling in car, there are a couple of car parks within walking distance, including Jedburgh Car Park, and that sits on the outskirts of the town beneath the town's impressive Abbey ruins, or there's another off the A68 near the Jedburgh Tourist Information Centre. Now, Jedburgh is, however, a relatively small town, so unless you have significant mobility issues, either car park is within a 5 to 10 minute walk of the tower house, which today is formally known as the Mary Queen of Scots Visitor Centre. And maybe one more thing, as you have just heard me mention, Jedburgh Abbey is probably one of the most obvious and impressive historic buildings related to the town. Today it is in ruins. In its time, it was attacked and burnt down twice by invading English forces, but in fact its ultimate demise came in 1559 when it was suppressed as part of the Protestant Reformation in Scotland. Now, my friends, there is a blog associated with this A to Z where I am going to go, as I said, into much more detail about the illness that Mary suffered whilst at Jedburgh. And you can click on the link above or indeed on the description below to read my account and see for yourself just what a dramatic series of events occurred and how it was nothing short of a medical miracle that Mary seems to have been brought back to life. Well, that is all for today's A to Z of Tudor / Stuart places. I hope you've enjoyed our virtual tour of Jedburgh, and that has given you some food for thought and some inspiration for your next road trip. Make sure you join me next month where we'll be looking at the letter K, and I'll be exploring the mighty Kenilworth Castle, which has oodles of history related, of course, to Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley. So until then, my friends, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling.